At 2:13 in the morning, a black janitor shoved his cleaning cart hard against a restricted engineering door, forced it open, and sat down at the one computer 11 engineers had failed to fix in 4 days. 50 floors up, the CEO, who had once told her assistant to move the cleaning man away from my meeting, watched the security feed and felt her stomach drop because the janitor she'd ignored for 3 years was typing faster than anyone she had ever hired. What she didn't know yet was who he used to be. Before you keep going, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And subscribe, because you will want to see how this one ends. Caleb Johnson had a rule, and the rule was simple. Keep your head down. Keep the floors clean. Keep them from ever having a reason to say your name. For 3 years, the rule had held. He pushed his cart down the 44th floor of Whitmore Technologies at 9:40 at night, the wheels squeaking. The same squeak they squeaked every night, and he nodded at the 2 engineers, still hunched over their monitors, even though they never nodded back. They didn't tonight either. One of them, a young man named Deshaun Price, glanced up, saw the gray uniform, saw the mop, and looked back down like Caleb was a piece of furniture that had rolled itself into the room. Evening, Caleb said anyway. Nothing. He didn't take it personally. He'd stopped taking it personally around month 4. You couldn't survive a job like this taking it personally. You'd bleed out by Christmas. He emptied the trash bins one by one. He wiped down the glass conference wall where somebody had left a half-finished diagram in dry erase marker arrows boxes, a word circled 3 times that Caleb read without meaning to, and then read again because it wasn't right. He straightened. He looked at it a second longer than a janitor was supposed to look at anything. Then he wiped it away because that was the job, and the job did not include opinions. His radio crackled. It was Marcus, the night supervisor, a heavy-set man with a good heart and a bad back. Caleb, you clear on 44, almost boss. When you're done, they want the executive floor turned around before 6. Big day tomorrow. Whitmore's got the whole board coming in. Copy that. And Caleb. A pause. Stay out of the engineering wing on 50. They got it locked down. Some kind of emergency. Above our pay grade, brother. Caleb keyed the radio. Wouldn't dream of it. He meant it too. At 9:41 that night, he had no intention of ever setting foot in that room. He had a daughter to get home to in the morning. He had a life that fit inside a very small, very safe box, and he had built that box with his own 2 hands after the last time the world decided who he was without asking him first. He had no idea that in a little under 5 hours, he was going to blow the lid right off it. Maya was 7 years old, and she had opinions about everything. She had opinions about the way Caleb cut her sandwiches diagonal. Never straight. A straight cut was, in her words, a crime. She had opinions about which of her stuffed animals got to sleep on the pillow, rotating schedule strictly enforced. And every single morning at 6:45, when Caleb came through the door of their 1-bedroom apartment, smelling like industrial cleaner, and 44 floors of other people's trash, she had exactly one opinion that mattered more than all the rest. Daddy's home. She said it the same way every day. Not a question, not a greeting. A fact she needed the universe to confirm. That morning, the morning before the night that changed everything, Caleb came in and found her already at the kitchen table, spelling homework, spread out in front of her, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth, the way it did when she was concentrating. You're up early, baby. I couldn't sleep. Mrs. Alvarez said we have a spelling test, and I keep getting necessary wrong. Caleb set down his keys. He was tired in a way that lived somewhere behind his eyes, a tiredness that 8 hours of sleep never touched. But he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down like he had all the time in the world. All right, he said. Necessary. 1 collar, 2 sleeves. Maya frowned. What? A shirt. 1 collar, that's your 1C. 2 sleeves, that's your 2 S's. Necessary. She stared at him. Then she wrote it out slow and looked up. I got it right. Course you did. You're smart. Smarter than your old man was at your age. That's not true, Maya said with the fierce loyalty only a 7-year-old can manage. You're the smartest daddy in the whole building." Caleb laughed, and it was a real laugh, and for a second the tiredness lifted. The whole building, huh? The whole world. If you had told Maya Johnson that the people her father cleaned up after every night did not think he was smart, that they didn't think about him at all, that most of them couldn't have picked him out of a lineup, even though he emptied their trash 300 nights a year, she would not have understood it. In her world, that was impossible. In her world, her father knew everything. He fixed the leaky faucet. He fixed her broken tablet with a paperclip and a steady hand. He explained why the sky was blue and why the moon followed the car, and why bad things sometimes happen to good people. That last one he never quite got right, but she never noticed because he always ended it the same way. Doesn't matter what happens to you, Maya. Matters what you do next. You hear me? You always get to choose what you do next. I hear you, Daddy. He kissed the top of her head. He made her breakfast. He walked her to the bus stop at 7:50, holding her hand the whole way, even though she'd started telling him she was too big for that. And he watched the bus pull away, and he waved until she couldn't see him anymore. Then he went home and slept until it was time to do it all again. That was the life. That was the whole box. And Caleb Johnson would have kept living inside it for the rest of his days, quietly, invisibly, safely, if a company worth $11 billion hadn't started falling apart 44 floors above his daughter's bedtime. The falling apart had a name, and the name was Orion. Caleb didn't understand it, not officially. Officially, he was a janitor, and janitors didn't understand billion-dollar artificial intelligence platforms. But he had ears, and the engineering floor was loud when things went wrong, and things had been going wrong for 4 days. He'd heard the shouting through the glass on the first night. It crashed again. We just rolled it back. I'm telling you, it's not the rollback, it's the load balancer. It is not the load balancer. Priya, I have been staring at the load balancer for 6 hours. He'd heard the blame on the second night, sharper now the way voices get when people are scared and haven't slept. Whose commit was this? Somebody pushed something Tuesday, and now the whole system's eating itself. Don't look at me. I'm not looking at anybody, I'm asking. He'd heard the despair on the third night. That was the worst one. Despair was quieter than blame. It sounded like a man named Deshaun Price, sitting alone at 3 a.m. with his head in his hands, saying to no one, "We're gonna lose it. We're actually gonna lose it." And Caleb, wiping down a trash can 8 feet away, had wanted so badly to say something that his jaw hurt from keeping it shut, because he knew that sound. Not the technical sound, the human one. The sound of good people watching something they'd built start to die and not being able to save it. The sound of the walls closing in while the powerful people upstairs decided whose fault it was going to be. He'd made that sound himself once, in a room a lot like that one, in a life that didn't belong to him anymore. 50 floors up, and 11 years earlier, that life had a different shape. Caleb Johnson had been the kind of engineer other engineers whispered about. Not the loud kind, never the loud kind. He didn't give the talks or chase the promotions. He was the one they called at 4 a.m. when the thing that couldn't break had broken. He'd designed core architecture that ran inside systems he'd never even see. Quiet, elegant machinery humming away underneath a dozen products with names he didn't recognize. He'd had a wife then, Danielle. He'd had a house with a real backyard. He'd had a future so bright it embarrassed him a little. And then a man named Richard Blackwell needed a scapegoat. Caleb still didn't have the whole picture even now. He knew the shape of it. Money had gone missing from a client account. Records had been altered. And when the smoke cleared and somebody had to burn for it, the somebody had a name that didn't come with a country club membership or a golfing buddy on the board. He remembered the meeting. He remembered walking in, thinking he was there to help investigate, and walking out understanding slowly, then all at once, that he was the investigation. He remembered the faces around that table. Not angry faces. That was the thing nobody tells you. They weren't angry. They were comfortable. They had already decided, and deciding had been easy, and now they just needed him to sit still while they did it. He remembered saying, "I didn't do this. He remembered Richard Blackwell, silver hair, warm voice, a man everybody trusted. Folding his hands and saying gently, "Caleb, son, it'll go easier if you just—" "I did not do this. If you just cooperate." He remembered how no one, not one single person in that room full of people he'd worked beside for years, looked at him like they believed him. The story got out before the truth could. That's how it always works. By the time anyone might have thought to ask a harder question, Caleb Johnson was already the guy who stole. Every door in the industry had the same lock on it, and his name was the wrong key. He applied to 41 companies in 8 months. He got 2 interviews. Both ended the second somebody made a phone call. Danielle held on longer than most would have. But the pressure was a slow poison, and one morning she sat on the edge of the bed and said in a voice with nothing left in it, "I can't watch this break you, Caleb, and I can't let it break her." Maya was 11 months old. He didn't fight it. That was the thing he was proudest of and most ashamed of both at once. He didn't fight because fighting cost money he didn't have, and because some cold, clear part of him understood that a custody battle waged by an accused thief was a battle he would lose, and losing meant Maya paid the price for his war. So he signed. And Danielle took a job in another state, and the deal they made quietly without lawyers in the end was that Maya would stay with Caleb because Danielle's new life had no room in it, and because whatever else had died between them, they both knew the same true thing: that man would walk through fire for that little girl. He just had to figure out how to feed her. The janitor position came through a temp agency that didn't run the kind of background check that mattered. Night shift. Benefits after 90 days. Nobody asked him what he used to do, and he never told them. For 3 years, he had been very, very good at being nobody at all. Adriana Whitmore had not slept in her own bed in 5 days. She'd catch 2 hours on the couch in her office, wake up with a crease in her cheek from the button of a throw pillow, and get back on the phone. Her father had built Whitmore Technologies out of a garage and a stubborn streak, and when he died, he'd left it to her along with a sentence she thought about every day. "They'll wait for you to fail, Adriana. Don't give them the satisfaction." Orion was going to give them the satisfaction. It was the single largest contract in the company's history. It was the reason for the board meeting tomorrow. It was, if she was being honest at 3 in the morning, when honesty was cheap, the reason she'd become the CEO her father wanted, instead of the person her mother had hoped she'd be. And it had been dying live in front of her for 96 hours, and every one of the brilliant, expensive people she'd hired to save it had come back with the same answer. "We don't know." She stood at the glass wall of the 50th floor engineering bay at 1:50 in the morning, arms crossed, watching her best people fail. "Talk to me, Priya." Priya Nair, lead engineer, hadn't seen a mirror in 3 days, and it showed. "It's the same as an hour ago. It runs clean for maybe 40 minutes, and then memory usage spikes for no reason and the whole platform seizes. We've profiled it 100 times. There's no leak we can find." "Find it, Adriana." Priya's voice cracked just slightly. "We've been finding it for 4 days. Deshaun Price spoke up from the back, quiet. "It's like something's calling itself, over and over, deep in the scheduler, but when we trace it, it's not there. It's like chasing a ghost." "A ghost," Adriana repeated. "I don't know what else to call it." Adriana looked at the room full of exhausted geniuses, and for the first time in 5 days, she felt something worse than fear. She felt the certainty that they were going to lose. She turned to her assistant hovering by the door. "Send them home at 4. Rotating shifts. I want fresh eyes at 6. A pause. "And get the cleaning crew up here to reset the space before the board arrives, but keep them out until my people are gone. I don't want—" She stopped. "Don't want what?" "I don't want anybody wandering around in here who doesn't understand what they're looking at." At 2 a.m., the engineers filed out. At 2:05, Marcus radioed down to the 44th floor. "Caleb, change of plans. They cleared the engineering wing for a reset. Executive floor can wait." They want 50 done first bins, glass the works. Just don't touch the workstations. Wipe around them. Caleb keyed the radio. On my way up. He did not know riding the service elevator to the 50th floor at 2:08 in the morning that he was riding toward the end of his old life. He was thinking about Maya's spelling test. He was thinking 1 collar, 2 sleeves. He was thinking he'd be home in time to make her the diagonal sandwich, and that if he hurried, they might have a few extra minutes before the bus. That's all he was thinking about. His daughter, the way it should be. The engineering bay was empty when he got there. Empty, but not quiet. The machines were still running, still humming their patient electric hum, and up on the big wall monitor, a status dashboard glowed green boxes and red boxes, numbers climbing and falling. Caleb had cleaned this room 100 times. He'd never really looked at that wall. He looked at it now. He didn't mean to. It was the way it always was. The same helpless reflex that had made him read the circled word on the whiteboard downstairs. He started pushing his cart toward the first row of desks, eyes down, rule intact, and then a number on the wall did something. Memory usage spiked. He watched it climb 60, 70, 80%, and then a red box bloomed across the top of the dashboard and a soft alarm chimed somewhere, and the whole display froze. 40 minutes clean, then it seizes. That's what Priya had said, though Caleb had never heard her say it. He hadn't needed to. He'd watched it happen with his own eyes in the span of 30 seconds, and something in the back of his mind, a part he'd spent 3 years starving, sat up. That's not a leak, the starved part said. That's a loop. Caleb stopped pushing the cart. No, he said out loud to nobody. No, we're not doing this. He went back to the bins. He really did. He emptied the first one and the second one and told himself the number on the wall was not his problem. Had never been his problem, was so far above his pay grade, it was practically in orbit. He wiped the glass. He picked a coffee cup up off Deshaun Price's desk, and there, next to it, on a legal pad, in a young man's frustrated all-caps handwriting, was written, "Where is it calling itself from?" And under it, smaller, defeated, "We're going to lose it." Caleb set the coffee cup down. He stood there in the empty room for a long moment, and everything he'd built for 3 years, the box, the rule, the safe, small, invisible life pressed down on him all at once, because he knew where it was calling itself from. He didn't just suspect. He knew with a certainty that scared him, the same certainty he used to feel in the old life when the answer arrived before he'd finished asking the question. He knew, because 11 years ago, he had designed a scheduling architecture with exactly this shape, and he had built into it exactly this kind of recursive safeguard. And he knew the way. You know your own child's cough in a crowd, that if you configured that safeguard wrong under exactly this kind of load, it would start quietly calling itself deeper and deeper, a ghost chasing its own tail through the machine until the whole thing choked to death. They're looking at the scheduler like it's the problem, he thought. The scheduler's fine. It's the thing they built on top of it. It's 4 lines. It's 4 lines and a fresh set of eyes, and they've been staring so hard for 4 days they can't see it. He could fix it in 12 minutes. He could also lose everything in 12 minutes. He stood in that empty room and did the math the way a father does the math. If he sat down at that workstation and somebody found out, and somebody always found out, what would they say? A janitor. In a restricted room. Touching an $11 billion platform. A janitor with no name and no credentials, and if anyone dug a history that read like a rap sheet, they wouldn't ask if he'd fixed it. They'd ask what he'd broken. They'd ask what he'd stolen. They'd already decided who he was 11 years ago. They'd just decided again. He'd lose the job. Lose the apartment probably before he found another. Lose the small, steady certainty that had become the whole architecture of Maya's world. Daddy comes home at 6:45. Daddy makes the diagonal sandwich. Daddy is always there. Doesn't matter what happens to you. He heard himself telling her. 1,000 mornings matters what you do next. He hated his own words right then. He hated them because they were true, and because he'd said them out loud to a 7-year-old, and because he had exactly two choices standing in front of him, and both of them cost too much. He looked at the legal pad again. We're going to lose it. He thought about Deshaun Price with his head in his hands at 3 in the morning. 26 years old maybe. Younger than Caleb had been. And Caleb knew because he'd lived it exactly how tomorrow was going to go for that kid if Orion died tonight. Somebody was going to need a name to say. Somebody upstairs, comfortable and calm, was going to fold their hands and pick the person in the room with the least power to fight back. And that person was going to walk out of here carrying a thing that wasn't theirs to carry, and every door in the industry was going to get the same new lock. He'd watched it happen to himself, and there'd been nobody in the room to stop it. There was somebody in this room. "Damn it!" Caleb whispered. "Damn it!" He looked up at the security camera in the corner. The little red light. Somebody might be watching. Probably wasn't at 2:40 in the morning, but somebody might be. He looked at it for a long 3 seconds, and then he did something he hadn't done in 11 years. He stopped being invisible on purpose. He didn't sit at Deshaun's station. Some instinct told him not to touch the kid's setup, not to leave the boy holding anything. He rolled his cart to the empty terminal at the end of the row, a shared diagnostic station, no name on it, and he pulled out the chair and he sat down. His hands hovered over the keyboard. It had been 11 years. 11 years since he'd done anything with these hands but scrub and lift and hold his daughter's hand at a bus stop. He half expected them to have forgotten. He was almost hoping they had, because if they'd forgotten, he could stand up and walk away and keep the box intact and never have to know. He put his fingers on the keys. They remembered. God help him, they remembered everything. He pulled up the process monitor first, and the moment the readout scrolled across the screen, it was like a language he'd been forbidden to speak, coming rushing back, not learned, not recalled, just there, the way your own heartbeat is there. He watched the scheduler. He watched the memory. He waited for the spike, and when it came, he was ready for it, and he followed it down through layer after layer. Past every place the exhausted engineers had already looked into a corner of the system so quiet and so deep that 4 days of frightened people hadn't thought to check it, because who would build a fire there? He would. He had. Not this exact code. Someone had taken his old architecture and grown a company on top of it. But the bones were his bones, and he knew where the bones were buried. And there it was. A recursive call configured to guard against overload, set with a threshold that was almost right. Almost. Off by a single condition. Under normal load, invisible. Under the load Orion was carrying tonight, it tripped and called itself to fix the problem. And calling itself created the problem, so it called itself again and again, a ghost feeding on its own tail, exactly the way Deshaun Price had said, even though Deshaun didn't know he'd said it. 4 lines. Caleb sat very still and looked at 4 lines of code, and felt something move in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in over a decade. It wasn't pride exactly. It was worse than pride. It was recognition. This is who I am. This is who I have been the whole time I was pushing that cart. This is the man who skips his own dinner so his daughter can eat. And this is also him, and he's been in here the whole time, and nobody in 3 years ever once looked at the uniform and thought there might be somebody home. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the strange, terrible joy of being for 12 minutes at 2:40 in the morning entirely himself. He didn't rush it. He'd learned in the old life that the mistakes happen in the last 10% when you can already taste it. He traced the fix all the way through. He checked what it touched. He checked what it touched that. He made sure that when he changed those 4 lines, he wasn't Caleb Johnson. The accused wasn't Caleb Johnson. The janitor wasn't anything at all except a careful man doing careful work. Then at 2:52 in the morning, in a room he was forbidden to be in on a system, he was forbidden to touch with a daughter asleep across town who thought he was the smartest daddy in the whole world. Caleb Johnson reached out and began to type. 50 floors up in her office, Adriana Whitmore had not gone to the couch. She'd meant to. She'd sent everyone home and stood in the dark for a while, and finally, out of some restless dread she couldn't name, pulled up the security feed on her laptop, not to spy, just to look, just to see the empty bay and the frozen dashboard, and confirm to herself that yes, this was really happening. Her father's company was really going to fail on her watch. She saw the cleaning crew had arrived. One man, gray uniform, cart. She almost closed the laptop. Then the man on the screen stopped pushing his cart. He stood in the middle of her engineering bay, and he looked at the wall of monitors, and he stood there so long and so still that Adriana leaned in, frowning, because janitors did not stand like that. Janitors kept moving. This one had stopped like a man who'd seen a ghost, or like a man who'd finally, after a long time, seen something he recognized. She watched him pick up a coffee cup and put it back down. She watched him look up directly at the camera straight at her, though he couldn't have known she was there. And then she watched the janitor she had told her assistant to keep away from her important room walk to a diagnostic terminal, pull out the chair and sit down. "What are you?" Adriana breathed. Her hand went for the phone. Security. She'd call security. Some cleaning man was about to touch a system worth more than most countries, and she'd have him escorted out and probably fired, and her hand stopped. Because on the security feed, the man had started to type. And on the second monitor, the one mirroring the engineering dashboard, the one that had been frozen red for 4 days. Something happened that Adriana Whitmore had been begging 11 of the smartest people she'd ever hired to make happen for 96 sleepless hours. A red box turned yellow. She sat down very slowly in her chair. She did not call security. She watched the man's hands move across the keyboard, fast, sure unhurried, the hands of somebody who was not guessing, who had never in his life been guessing. And she watched a second red box turn yellow, and she felt her heart begin to pound in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Who are you?" she whispered to the screen. Down on the 50th floor, in the room where he was not supposed to be, the man everyone in that building had spent 3 years looking straight through, kept typing and did not hear her and would not have cared if he had. He had a fix to finish, and a daughter to get home to by 6:45. The third red box turned yellow at 2:56, and Caleb barely noticed because by then he was already 3 steps ahead of himself, already tracing what the fix would touch the moment the load came back. He typed the way a man breathes when he's finally been let up from underwater. He didn't stop to admire it. He'd learned a long time ago that admiring your own work was how you got sloppy, and sloppy was a luxury for people who had room to fail. Caleb had never had room to fail. Not 11 years ago, and not tonight. The last red box on the wall turned yellow, and then one at a time, the yellow boxes began to go green. He leaned back in the chair and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 4 days, even though he'd only been in the room for 20 minutes. On the dashboard, the memory graph that had been climbing and seizing for 96 hours finally leveled out. It ran clean. 40 minutes clean, an hour clean. He didn't have an hour to wait and watch it, but he didn't need to. He knew. The ghost was gone. He'd found where it was calling itself from, and he'd told it to stop, and it had stopped, because at the end of the day, it was only a machine, and machines did what you told them if you spoke the language. And Caleb Johnson had never once forgotten the language, no matter how hard the world had tried to make him. "All right," he said quietly to the empty room. "All right." Then the fear caught up to him. It came all at once, the way it does when the work is done, and there's nothing left to hold it back. His hands, which had been so steady on the keys, started to shake again, and this time it wasn't joy. He looked at the terminal. He looked at what he'd done. He'd just sat down at a workstation inside a restricted engineering bay at a company that had never once said his name, and he'd changed the code of an $11 billion platform, and there was a camera in the corner with a little red light, and somewhere in this building, there was a record of every keystroke he'd just made. "What did you do?" he thought. "Caleb, what did you just do?" He stood up so fast the chair rolled back and hit the desk behind him. He grabbed the edge of the workstation to steady himself. For one wild second, he thought about undoing it, reverting the change, putting the ghost back, walking out and pretending he'd never seen the wall of monitors at all. He could do it. It would take 30 seconds. Nobody would ever know Orion had been saved, but nobody would ever know a janitor had touched it either, and the box would stay intact, and Maya would get her diagonal sandwich and her father at 6:45, and the small, safe, certain life that was the only thing he had left to give her. He put his fingers back on the keys, and he couldn't. He couldn't do it, and it took him a second to understand why, and when he understood it, he almost laughed. He couldn't put the ghost back because Deshaun Price was going to walk into this room at 6 in the morning, and if Orion was still dying, that kid was going to be the one holding it. Caleb had done the math already. He'd done it before he ever sat down. Somebody upstairs comfortable and calm was going to need a name, and it wasn't going to be the name of anyone with a lawyer on retainer. It was going to be the youngest, the quietest, the one with the least power to fight back, and Caleb had watched that exact machine grind a man to nothing 11 years ago, and the man had been him, and there had been nobody in the room. There was somebody in the room now, and that somebody had just fixed it, and he was not going to unfix it to save his own skin, because if he did that, then Richard Blackwell had been right about him all along, and Caleb Johnson would rather lose the job and the apartment and everything than let that be true. So he took his hands off the keys. He left the fix in place, but he was not going to sign his name to it. He looked around the workstation and found a legal pad, a clean one, not Deshaun's, and a pen. And he sat back down and he thought for a moment about what to write. He wanted it to be enough that they'd understand so the fix would hold, and nobody would panic and roll it back and bring the ghost right back to life. But he didn't want it to be so much that they'd come looking. He wanted to give them the answer and disappear. He'd gotten very good at disappearing. He wrote in careful block letters, nothing that could be traced to a hand. The failure is not in the scheduler. Everyone is looking at the scheduler. The scheduler is fine. There is a recursive safeguard 4 layers down in the overload handler that was built on top of the original architecture. Its threshold condition is off by 1. Under heavy load, it calls itself to prevent a crash, and the call is what causes the crash, so it calls itself again. It is not a memory leak. It is a loop that feeds on itself. I have corrected the 4 lines. Watch it under load before you trust me. But it will hold. He paused, the pen hovering. Then at the bottom he wrote, "You have good people in this room. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." A friend. He read it over once. He tore the sheet off the pad, folded it once, and set it in the middle of Deshaun Price's desk, right on top of the legal pad, where the kid had written, "We're going to lose it," in the small, defeated handwriting of a man who thought his career was ending. Caleb looked at those words one more time, and then he covered them with his own, and the 2 pages sat there together in the dark. The despair and the answer. And only one of them had a name attached, and it was the wrong one. He put the pen back. He straightened the chair. He wiped down the workstation he'd used with the cloth from his cart, not to hide fingerprints. The camera had him cold, and he knew it. But out of some reflex older than the fear. The reflex that said, "Leave the space better than you found it." The reflex that had kept him employed and invisible for 3 years. Then he pushed his cart out of the engineering bay and rode the service elevator down and clocked out at 3:11 in the morning and went home to make his daughter breakfast. He did not sleep on the bus. He usually could a few stolen minutes, but not that morning. He sat by the window with his forehead against the cold glass and watched the city go by and waited for the phone to ring. He was sure it would ring. He was sure that by the time he got home, there'd be a message from Marcus, or worse, from someone above Marcus, someone with a calm, comfortable voice asking him to come in for a conversation. He'd heard that voice before. He knew how those conversations went. The phone didn't ring. He got home at 6:44, 1 minute early, and he let himself in as quietly as he could, and Maya was already awake at the kitchen table, with her spelling homework tongue poking out the side of her mouth, and she looked up and said the same as every morning, "Daddy's home." And Caleb Johnson, who had just saved a company that didn't know his name, and might yet destroy him for it, stood in the doorway of his 1-bedroom apartment and looked at his daughter and felt his eyes sting. "Yeah, baby," he said. "Daddy's home. You look funny." "I'm just tired." "Did you have a hard night at work?" He came in and set down his keys and hung up his jacket, and he thought about how to answer that, And in the end, he told her the truth, or a piece of it small enough to fit in a 7-year-old's hands. "I helped somebody with something," he said. "Something that was broken. I wasn't sure I remembered how, but I did." Maya nodded like this made perfect sense, because in her world, her father could fix anything. "Was it hard?" "The hard part wasn't the fixing," Caleb said. "He got the bread out. He got the knife. Diagonal, never straight. A straight cut was a crime. The hard part was deciding to." "Why?" He looked at her over the counter. 7 years old, 2 missing teeth, the whole entire reason he got out of bed. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, "doing the right thing costs you something, and you don't always get to know ahead of time how much." Maya considered this while she watched him cut the sandwich. "But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway. Because it was the right thing. Because it was the right thing." She nodded again, satisfied, and went back to her spelling, and Caleb finished the sandwich and set it in front of her, cut on the diagonal. And he thought, whatever it costs, let it be worth it. Let this be the thing she remembers about me. Not what they said I was. This. The phone still didn't ring. He walked her to the bus stop at 7:50, holding her hand the whole way, and he waved until the bus was out of sight. And then he went home, and lay down on the couch in his clothes, and finally slept. And he dreamed for the first time in a long time of a room full of monitors turning green. 50 floors up, Adriana Whitmore had not slept at all. She'd watched the whole thing on the security feed, every minute of it, leaning closer and closer to the screen as the boxes turned from red to yellow to green, her coffee going cold and forgotten at her elbow. She'd watched the janitor stand up and steady himself on the desk, and sit back down and write something and fold it, and place it on one of her engineers' desks. She'd watched him wipe down the terminal and push his cart out of the room like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just done in 20 minutes what her entire team couldn't do in 4 days. And now it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and Priya Nair was standing in the doorway of Adriana's office, looking like she'd been hit by a truck, holding a folded piece of paper, and she said, "Adriana, you need to see this. Orion's been stable for 3 hours. Somebody fixed it." "I know," Adriana said. Priya blinked. You know." "Sit down, Priya. Who fixed it?" "Nobody was in the building. We all went home. You sent us home, and I came back in at 5, and it's just running. It's running. Adriana, it's been running clean for 3 hours, and there's this note." She held up the paper, her hand not quite steady. "This note that explains exactly what was wrong, and it's right. Whoever wrote this was right. It was the overload handler. It was 4 lines. 4 lines, and we've been—" Her voice broke. She stopped. She sat down. "Read it to me," Adriana said. Priya read it. The whole thing in a voice that got quieter and quieter. And when she got to, "You have good people in this room. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She stopped again and had to look away. And Adriana understood that this exhausted, brilliant woman, who had not slept in 4 days, had needed someone to tell her that. And the person who'd told her was a stranger who signed himself a friend. "Who is it?" Priya said finally. "Who's the friend? Did you bring somebody in? A consultant? Somebody from outside?" Adriana was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said. "I didn't bring anybody in." "Then who?" "Priya. I want you to verify the fix. I want you to run it under full load stress test. It do whatever you do, and I want to know by 9 o'clock whether it holds. Can you do that?" "Of course, but that's all for now. Thank you. Really. Go." Priya went clutching the note, and Adriana sat alone in her office and pulled up the security feed again and rewound it to 2:40 in the morning. And she watched the janitor walk into her engineering bay for the second time, and this time she watched his face. She'd never looked at his face before. That was the thing that got her sitting there in the gray early light. In 3 years, she had passed this man. She was almost sure she'd passed him in a hallway, in an elevator, in the periphery of some late night, and she had never once looked at his face, and now she couldn't stop. She watched him stand in front of the monitors and go still. She watched something move across his features, something she didn't have a word for, something that looked almost like grief. She watched him pick up the coffee cup and put it down. She watched him look up at the camera, straight into it, straight at her across 8 hours of time, and she felt a chill go up her arms. Then she picked up her phone and called Marcus, the night supervisor, who was just about to go off shift. "Marcus, this is Adriana Whitmore." There was a startled silence on the line. CEOs did not call night supervisors. "Ms. Whitmore, yes ma'am. Is everything all right?" "The cleaning crew on the 50th floor last night. There was one man on the engineering wing, around 2:33 o'clock. Marcus's voice changed. Instantly went careful and defensive, and Adriana heard it and understood it, because she'd heard people's voices do that around her before, and she'd never once stopped to think about why. "Ms. Whitmore, if there's a problem that's on me, I reassigned him up there myself. They cleared the wing for a reset, and I sent him to—" "There's no problem, Marcus. I'm not nobody's in trouble. I just need his name." A pause. "His name. The man who cleaned the engineering wing last night, what's his name?" "That's Caleb. Caleb Johnson. Ms. Whitmore, look, if he touched something he wasn't supposed to, I promise you he's a good worker. 3 years, never a complaint, never late. He's got a little girl at home, he's raising by himself, and he—" "Caleb Johnson." Adriana repeated, writing it down. "He'd never take anything if that's what this is about. I'd stake my job on it. That man is the most honest." "Marcus?" Adriana closed her eyes. "I promise you, he's not in any trouble, just the opposite. Thank you. That's all I needed." She hung up. She sat for a moment with the name written on the pad in front of her. Caleb Johnson. Then she opened her laptop and did the thing that would change everything. The thing she couldn't have known would change everything. She typed the name into the company's HR system to pull his file, and when that told her almost nothing, hired 3 years ago through a temp agency night shift. No complaints, no incidents. A man made deliberately of blank spaces. She did what any CEO with too much power and too little sleep does at 6 in the morning. She typed the name into a search engine, and the internet remembered Caleb Johnson, even though the world had tried so hard to forget him. The first result was 11 years old. It was a news item from a trade publication, the kind of thing that gets written when a mid-level financial scandal needs a face. The headline used the word fraud. There was a photograph, younger, no gray in the beard, but unmistakably the man from the security feed, the man who'd stood in her engineering bay and gone still. The article said he'd been an architect at a firm. She recognized a good firm, a firm that fed talent into companies like hers. It said money had gone missing from a client account. It said records had been altered. It said Caleb Johnson had been let go, and the matter referred. And then in the way these things go, it said almost nothing else, because the story had gotten what it needed from him, a name, a face, a villain, and moved on. Adriana read it twice. Then she went looking for what came after, and there was nothing. That was the strange part. There was no follow-up, no charges filed that she could find, no conviction, no trial. There was an accusation 11 years old with a photograph attached, and then there was silence, and then there was a temp agency and a night shift and a man who'd made himself into a blank space on purpose. She thought about this note. "You have good people in this room. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She thought about the thing that had crossed his face on the security feed when he stood in front of the monitors, that grief, that recognition. She thought about her father and the sentence he'd left her. "They'll wait for you to fail. Adriana, don't give them the satisfaction." And she thought, for the first time in a long time, about all the people who'd never gotten a company handed to them, who'd been waiting to fail, because somebody decided ahead of time that they would. Then Priya knocked on her door again at 8:50, and she was almost running. "It holds," Priya said. "Adriana, it holds. We ran it under 1.5 times peak load, twice peak. We tried to break it, and it runs. It's the cleanest it's been since we deployed." Whoever wrote that note didn't just patch it, they fixed the actual architecture. They fixed a flaw that's probably been sitting in there since before any of us started. We just never hit the load that exposed it until this contract. And she stopped breathing hard. Adriana, we're going to make the board meeting. We're going to be able to tell them Orion is fine. Better than fine. Whoever this is, whoever the friend is, they saved the entire... I know who it is, Adriana said. Priya stopped. You said you didn't bring anybody in. I didn't. Then how do you... His name is Caleb Johnson. Adriana turned the laptop around so Priya could see the screen, the 11-year-old article, the headline with the word fraud, the younger face. He's been cleaning this building for 3 years. He was on the 50th floor last night for a reset. He stood in front of that wall of monitors and he saw what none of us saw, and he sat down and he fixed it, and then he wrote you that note and went home. Priya stared at the screen. She read the headline. Her face did something complicated. A janitor, she said slowly. A janitor fixed Orion. Not a janitor. Adriana turned the laptop back around. An engineer. A very, very good one from the look of it, who happens to be working as a janitor, which is a different thing. Priya and I want you to sit with the difference for a second, because I'm sitting with it, and it is not comfortable. Priya sat with it. And to her credit, Adriana would remember this later, that Priya was one of the ones who got there fast. The first thing out of her mouth was not about the fraud. It was, what was on his face? What? You said he stood in front of the monitors, and you saw something. On the security feed. What was on his face? Adriana thought about how to say it. He looked, she said finally, like a man who was seeing something he used to love, and couldn't have anymore. Neither of them said anything for a moment. That article, Priya said. Does it say he actually did it, the fraud? It says he was accused. It doesn't say he was convicted. There's no follow-up, nothing. 11 years of nothing. Adriana rubbed her eyes. Which either means the charges quietly went away because they were nothing, or it means somebody made the whole thing disappear so nobody would ever check. And Priya, I have been running companies long enough to tell you that a story that big usually doesn't just stop unless somebody with power wanted it stopped. So what do we do? Adriana looked at the name on her pad. Caleb Johnson. She looked at the security feed frozen on the image of a man in a gray uniform sitting at a terminal he wasn't supposed to touch doing work. He wasn't supposed to be able to do for people who'd never once said his name. We find out the truth, she said. The whole truth, not the headline. And then, she stopped. And then what? And then I have to look that man in the eye, Adriana said very quietly, and figure out how to apologize for 3 years I didn't even know I owed him. That afternoon, while Caleb slept on his couch in his work clothes, dreaming of green monitors, Adriana Whitmore did 2 things. The first thing she did was walk into the board meeting at 2 o'clock and tell 14 of the most powerful people in the industry that Orion was fully operational, stress-tested, and more stable than it had ever been. She watched the relief go around the room. She watched the contract, the biggest in the company's history, settle back onto solid ground. She accepted the congratulations. Somebody said I knew your team would pull it off, and Adriana smiled and said thank you, and did not tell them that her team hadn't pulled it off, that a man they'd have had escorted out of the building had pulled it off because she wasn't ready yet, because she didn't have the whole truth yet, and because some part of her, a part she wasn't proud of, understood exactly how that story would land in that room, and understood that she needed to control how it landed, or it would land on Caleb the way the last story had. The second thing she did after the board meeting was hire an investigator. Not a corporate one. Not somebody from the company's usual firm. Somebody independent. Somebody she'd used once before for something delicate. A quiet woman named Renata Cho, who used to be a federal prosecutor, and now made her living finding out what really happened when the official version didn't add up. I need you to find out everything about a man named Caleb Johnson, Adriana told her on the phone. 11 years ago, he was an architect at Halverson Systems. There was an accusation of financial fraud. He was let go, and then the trail just stops. No charges I can find, nothing. I need to know what actually happened." "You want me to prove he did it, or prove he didn't?" Renata asked. It wasn't a cynical question. It was a professional one. "I want you to prove what's true," Adriana said. "That's all, whatever it is. I need to know before I do something I can't undo." "What are you thinking of doing?" Adriana looked out the window of her office down at the city, somewhere in which a man was sleeping off a night that had cost him more than he yet knew, or saved him more than he yet dared hope. And she didn't know which, and that was exactly the problem. "I'm thinking," she said, "of offering him his life back. And I don't want to offer it to a man who doesn't deserve it, and I really don't want to fail to offer it to a man who does. So find out. Fast." And Renata. There's a name in the old story I want you to pay attention to. The firm Halverson. Whoever was above him. Whoever benefited from the money that went missing. I want to know who that was, and I want to know where they are now. "You think somebody set him up?" "I think," Adriana said, "that a man who signs himself a friend and walks away without taking credit is not a man who steals. But I've been wrong about people before, so prove it. Either way." She hung up, and the investigation began, and somewhere in the machinery of it, a name that Caleb Johnson had spent 11 years trying to forget began very slowly to surface again: Richard Blackwell. But that was still days away, and Caleb didn't know any of it yet, and when he woke up that afternoon, the first thing he did was check his phone, and there was still no message from Marcus, still no calm, comfortable voice asking him to come in for a conversation. And he let himself believe for one more night that he'd gotten away with it, that he'd done the right thing in the dark and slipped back into invisibility before anyone could make him pay for it. He went to work that night the same as always. He clocked in at 9:30. He pushed his cart down the 44th floor, and Deshaun Price was there at his desk. And when Caleb came through with the cart, Deshaun looked up, and this time he didn't look back down. "Hey," Deshaun said. "Hey man, can I ask you something?" Caleb's whole body went cold, but his face didn't move. 3 years of practice. "Sure." "Were you up on 50 last night, on the engineering wing?" Caleb's hands stayed steady on the cart. "They had me do a reset up there. Cleared the whole floor." "Why?" Deshaun stood up. He had the note in his hand. Caleb could see it, the folded sheet of legal paper, his own block letters, and Caleb's heart was going so hard, he was sure the kid could hear it. But Deshaun wasn't looking at him like an accusation. He was looking at him like a question he was afraid to ask. "Did you see anybody up there? Anybody working? Anybody who wasn't cleaning crew?" And there it was. The door held open. All Caleb had to do was step through it. Yeah, there was a guy older. I didn't get a good look. He was on the terminal at the end. Deshaun would believe it. Everyone would believe it, because everyone already believed a janitor couldn't have done this. And Caleb could hand the whole thing to a phantom and go back to being invisible, and Maya would keep her diagonal sandwiches and her father at 6:45 forever. He opened his mouth to lie, and he looked at Deshaun Price, 26 years old, exhausted, holding a note that had told him, "You have good people in this room. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." A kid who'd been up all night not celebrating that Orion was saved, but trying to find out who saved it so he could say thank you. And Caleb found that he could not do it. Not the lie. The lie was easy. He'd told 1,000 small lies to stay invisible. What he couldn't do was look at this specific young man who'd been about to be sacrificed and didn't even know it, and feed him a phantom. So he did something in between. He did the thing that a careful man does when the whole truth costs too much but a lie costs more than he can stand. "No," Caleb said. "I didn't see anybody working. It was just me up there." Which was true. Every word of it was true. Deshaun's face fell a little, and he nodded, and he looked down at the note. "It's just somebody fixed it. Fixed the whole thing. Left this note. Signed it a friend. And I've been trying to figure out who, because—" He stopped and his voice did something, and Caleb realized the kid was close to tears, the way you get close to tears when you're young and exhausted, and someone you've never met just saved your entire life. "Because I thought we were done, man. I thought I was going to get blamed for it." It was on my part of the stack, the piece that failed, and I kept thinking, this is it. This is the thing that ends me. And then this friend just, "Hey," Caleb said. "Hey, you didn't get blamed. It got fixed. That's what matters. I just wanted to say thank you to whoever it was." Caleb looked at him for a long moment, and then he said very gently, "Maybe whoever it was already knows." Deshaun frowned, not quite understanding, and Caleb picked up the trash bin and emptied it and moved on down the row, pushing his cart, keeping his head down, and behind him, Deshaun Price stood holding a note from a friend he'd never identify. And up on the 50th floor, a woman was reading an 11-year-old headline and refusing for the first time in her career to accept the version of a man that had been handed to her. Caleb finished the 44th floor. He emptied the bins and wiped the glass and straightened the chairs, and the whole time his heart was still going, because he'd just come within one word of stepping back into the dark. And he hadn't done it, and he didn't fully understand why, except that somewhere in the last 24 hours, something in him had shifted that he wasn't sure he could shift back. For 3 years he'd told himself that invisibility was the price of keeping Maya safe, that being nobody was the same as being safe. But standing in front of those monitors at 2:40 in the morning, he'd remembered, his hands had remembered before his mind could stop them, that he was not nobody. He never had been. He'd just been hiding from the people who'd decided he was. And now, whether he wanted it or not, one of those people had seen him. His radio crackled at 11:40. Caleb. It was Marcus, but it wasn't Marcus's usual voice, the easy, tired, end-of-shift voice. It was careful. It was the careful voice, the one Caleb had been dreading since 3 o'clock that morning. "Yeah, boss. Can you come down to the supervisor's office when you get a minute?" Caleb closed his eyes. There it was, the calm, comfortable summons. He'd known it was coming. He'd let himself hope for one night that it wasn't, but he'd always known. "Everything okay, Marcus?" A pause. Yeah, I think so. Somebody upstairs wants to talk to you." And Caleb... Marcus lowered his voice, and there was something in it that Caleb couldn't read. Something that wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite anything he had a name for. "I don't think it's what you think it is. I told them you were the best worker I got. Whatever this is, I told them." Caleb stood alone on the 44th floor with his hand on the radio and his cart beside him, and 11 years of learned invisibility screaming at him to run, to clock out, to disappear the way he knew how to disappear, to go home to his daughter and never come back to this building where somebody with power had finally learned his name. And then he thought about Maya at the kitchen table. You did it anyway, because it was the right thing. He keyed the radio. "I'm on my way down," Caleb said. The walk down to the supervisor's office felt longer than 44 floors had any right to feel. Caleb took the service elevator, the one he always took, the one nobody important ever rode, and he stood in it with his hands folded in front of him, the way he'd learned to fold them. Small, unthreatening, taking up as little room as a man his size could manage. He'd spent 11 years making himself small. It had become the shape his body knew. Marcus was standing outside the office when the elevator opened, and the first thing Caleb noticed was that Marcus looked nervous, and Marcus never looked nervous, and that scared him more than anything Marcus could have said. "She's in there," Marcus said quietly. Ms. Whitmore." Marcus swallowed. "The CEO. She came down herself, Caleb. She's been in there 20 minutes just waiting. She sent everybody else out. It's just her." Caleb felt the floor tilt a little under him. In 3 years, he had never once been in the same room as Adriana Whitmore. He'd seen her the way you see weather from a distance, as a condition of the building. He knew her the way the whole company knew her, as the sharp woman on the top floor whose name was on the door. He knew because he'd heard it whispered by the day crew that she was the one who'd told her assistant to move the cleaning staff away from an important meeting once years ago, and that the assistant had come down and told Marcus, and Marcus had had to reassign the daytime crew's route around her floor, and everyone had understood without saying it that Ms. Whitmore did not want to see the people who cleaned up after her. Now she was waiting for him. alone. "Marcus," Caleb said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "If this is what I think it is, I don't think it is," Marcus said again, and there was something almost pleading in it, like he needed Caleb to believe him because he needed to believe it himself. "I've been doing this 20 years, brother. I know what it looks like when they're about to let somebody go. This isn't that. She didn't ask for your file. She didn't ask for HR. She asked for you, by name. She's been saying your name like—" He stopped. "Just go in. And Caleb, whatever happens, you're a good man. I mean that." Caleb looked at him, this heavy-set supervisor with the bad back and the good heart, who'd hired him 3 years ago without asking the wrong questions, who'd just told a CEO he'd stake his job on Caleb's honesty, and Caleb felt something catch in his throat. "Thank you, Marcus," he said, "for all of it." Then he opened the door and walked in. Adriana Whitmore was sitting at the small scratched table in the supervisor's office, a room with a broken chair and a coffee maker, with a cracked carafe and a bulletin board full of shift schedules. A room she had almost certainly never set foot in before tonight, and she stood up when he came in. That was the first thing that broke the pattern. People didn't stand up for Caleb. In 3 years, the powerful people in this building had made a habit of not even turning their heads. She stood up, and she looked at his face. Really looked the way she'd looked at the security feed, and Caleb saw her looking and didn't understand it, and it made every nerve in his body go tight. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "thank you for coming down. Please, sit." He didn't sit. Not yet. He stood just inside the door with his hands folded and his weight balanced like a man who might need to leave quickly. And he said in the careful, flat voice he used with people who had power over him, "You wanted to see me, ma'am." "I did." She stayed standing too then, when she saw he wouldn't sit. "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide how to feel about it. Can you do that?" Caleb said nothing. His silence was a yes, and they both knew it. "Last night," Adriana said, "somebody fixed Orion, our platform. The thing 11 of my engineers had been trying to save for 4 days. Somebody walked into the engineering bay at around 2:40 in the morning, sat down at a terminal, and fixed a flaw that my entire team couldn't find, and then that somebody wrote a note explaining exactly what was wrong and how to keep it fixed and signed it a friend and left." Caleb's face did not move. 3 years of practice. But his heart was slamming against his ribs so hard he was sure she could see it. "I don't know what you're referring to, ma'am," he said. "I cleaned the building." "I know you cleaned the building." Adriana's voice was very gentle. "I watched you clean it last night, on the security feed. I watched the whole thing, Mr. Johnson. I watched you stop in front of the monitors. I watched you go still. I watched you pick up a coffee cup and put it down, and look up at the camera, and sit down and fix it. I watched every second of it. I know it was you." The room was very quiet, and Caleb Johnson felt 11 years of carefully built architecture come down around him all at once, and he did the only thing he knew how to do when the walls came down, which was to reach for the truth he'd learned to fear. "Am I fired?" he said. It came out before he could stop it, and it came out raw, stripped of the careful flatness, because underneath the flatness, there was a man with a 7-year-old daughter, and an apartment he could barely afford, and a whole life balanced on the thin edge of a night shift paycheck, and that man was terrified. "What?" Adriana said. "Am I fired?" Caleb said again, and his voice cracked on it, and he hated that it cracked, but he couldn't stop it now. "Because if I'm fired, ma'am, I'd rather you just say it. I've got a little girl at home. I need to know if I've still got a job. So please, just tell me." And Adriana Whitmore, who had walked into that room with a whole careful speech prepared, who had rehearsed how she'd broach it, who had imagined 100 versions of this conversation, felt the entire speech evaporate because none of her rehearsals had accounted for the possibility that the man who'd saved her company would walk in braced to be destroyed. "No," she said. "God, no. Mr. Johnson, Caleb, no. You're not fired. That's the opposite of why I'm here." Caleb didn't move. He'd learned not to trust the sudden kindness of powerful people. Kindness from the top of the building had a way of turning into something else halfway down. Then what am I doing here? Sit down, Adriana said. Please, I'm asking you as not as your CEO. I'm asking you as a person who watched you do something last night that I don't fully understand, and who has spent all day trying to. Something in the way she said it got through, and Caleb slowly, warily pulled out the broken chair, the one that wobbled, and sat down on the edge of it, ready to stand back up, and Adriana sat down across from him. You saved the company, she said. You understand that, right? That contract, Orion, it's the largest in our history. If it had failed, we'd have lost it, and losing it would have started a cascade I'm not sure we'd have recovered from. Hundreds of jobs. Maybe the whole company. You saved all of it. Last night, in 20 minutes. With 4 lines of code that 11 people with advanced degrees couldn't find. I didn't do it for the company, Caleb said. It surprised her. No, ma'am. He looked at his hands. I don't know your company. I clean it. I did it because there was a young man on the 4th floor. The 4th floor down from where the fix was, a kid named Deshaun, and it was on his part of the system, the part that failed. And I've been listening to him for 4 nights come apart, because he thought it was his fault, and he thought he was going to lose everything for it. Caleb looked up. And I knew he wasn't going to lose it because of the code. I knew he was going to lose it because when something that big breaks somebody powerful, needs a name to say, and it's never the powerful person's name. It's the kids. It's the quiet ones. It's whoever's got the least room to fight back. Adriana went very still. I did it, Caleb said, because I couldn't sit there and watch it happen to somebody else. Not again. Not again, Adriana repeated softly. And Caleb realized what he'd said, and he closed his mouth, and the flatness came back down over his face like a shutter. I've said too much. If I'm not fired, ma'am, I'd like to get back to my floor. I've got the executive level to turn around before 6. Caleb. Adriana's voice stopped him halfway out of the chair. I know who you are. He froze. I know you were an architect at Halverson Systems, she said. I know that 11 years ago there was an accusation of financial fraud. I know you were let go, and I know that after that the trail just stops. No charges I can find, no conviction, no trial. Just an accusation with a photograph, and then silence. And then 3 years ago, a man named Caleb Johnson started cleaning my building at night. She leaned forward. I've read the headline, Caleb. I know what it says you did. And I'm sitting here looking at a man who fixed $1 billion system and walked away without taking a dime of credit. And I have to tell you, those two things do not fit together. A man who steals does not decline the credit. So I'm asking you. And I'll believe whatever you tell me, because I've spent all day learning that I've been believing the wrong things about you for 3 years. She took a breath. Did you do it? The room was silent for a long, long moment, and Caleb Johnson looked at this woman, this CEO, who had once told her assistant to keep the cleaning staff away from her, who had passed him 100 times without seeing him, who was now sitting in a broken chair in a room she'd never been in, asking him a question no one had asked him in 11 years, and he felt something break loose in his chest, something he'd packed down so hard and so long that he'd almost forgotten it was there. No, he said. And his voice was steady, now steadier than it had been all night. No, ma'am, I didn't do it. Tell me what happened. Why? The word came out sharp, sharper than he meant, and he saw her flinch, and he didn't take it back. Why do you want to know? 11 years ago, I stood in a room full of people I'd worked with for years, and I said those exact words, I did not do this, and not one of them looked at me like they believed me. You know why? Because they didn't need to. They'd already decided. It was easier to decide, I did it, than to look at who actually did. So, forgive me. Ms. Whitmore, if I don't understand why a woman who told her assistant to move the cleaning man away from her meetings suddenly wants to hear my side of an 11-year-old story. He watched the words land. He watched them hit her, and he braced for what came next because he knew what came next. When you spoke to power like that, he knew the temperature dropped. He knew the kindness curdled. He knew this was the moment. The sudden warmth turned back into the cold thing, It always really was. It didn't. Adriana Whitmore sat with what he'd said. She didn't flinch away from it, and she didn't fire back. She let it sit there in the room between them, and then she said quietly, "You're right. I did that. I don't remember doing it, and I want you to understand that's not an excuse. That's the worst part. I did it so casually that I don't even remember it. I moved you out of my sight the way you move a chair. And you've been in this building 3 years, and I never once looked at your face until I watched you save my company on a security camera at 2 in the morning." She swallowed. "So you're right to ask why. And the honest answer is that I don't have the right to your story. You don't owe it to me. If you want to walk back up to the executive floor and never say another word to me, that's your right, and I'll make sure you keep your job, and I'll double your pay, and you'll never have to think about this conversation again." Caleb stared at her. "But..." Adriana said, "I'm asking anyway, not because I've earned it, because I've already started looking. I've got someone looking into what really happened at Halverson, and she's good, and she's going to find the truth whether you tell me or not. And I would rather hear it from you than read it in a report. Because you're the one it happened to, and you've spent 11 years having other people tell your story for you. I thought maybe you might want to tell it yourself, just once, to somebody who'll actually listen, and that was the thing that undid him. Not the offer of the job, not the doubled pay. It was that last part, somebody who'll actually listen, because in 11 years, that was the one thing no one had offered him. People had offered him pity and suspicion, and the averted eyes of 100 hallways. But no one had ever sat down across a scratched table and said, "Tell me what happened. I'll listen." Not Danielle at the end. She'd been too tired, too frightened, too worn down by the poison of it. Not the lawyers he couldn't afford. Not one single soul in 11 years. Caleb looked down at his hands, the same hands that had remembered the code, and he started to talk. "His name was Richard Blackwell," he said. Adriana didn't move. But something flickered behind her eyes, because that was the name Renata Cho had surfaced that very afternoon, the name at the top of the chain, and Adriana had told herself she wouldn't say it. She'd let Caleb say it, or not say it on his own, and here he was, saying it unprompted, and it landed in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. "He was senior," Caleb went on, "way above me. Everybody trusted him. Silver hair, good voice, the kind of man who remembers your kid's name and asks about your weekend. I liked him. God help me, I liked him." He shook his head slowly. "There was a client account, a big one. Money started going missing out of it, not all at once, a little at a time, structured so it wouldn't trip the alarms. And by the time anybody noticed, it was a lot of money, and there had to be a reason, and there had to be a person. And the person was you. The person was me." Caleb's jaw tightened. The records showed my credentials on the transactions, my access, my footprints all over it. And I sat in that meeting and I looked at the logs they put in front of me, and I couldn't explain it, because the credentials were mine and I hadn't done it. And do you know how insane it feels to be looking at proof of a thing you know you didn't do, to have the evidence sitting right there in your own name? He looked up at her. "I built systems, Ms. Whitmore. That was my whole life. I knew that if you have the right access, you can make the logs say anything you want. You can borrow a man's credentials and wear them like a coat. And the one person at that firm with the access to do it, the person who administered the very system those logs came out of, was Richard Blackwell. And when I said that, when I stood up in that meeting and said, 'I think somebody used my credentials, I think this was done to me,' do you know what happened? What happened?" "Richard Blackwell folded his hands," Caleb said, "and he looked at me with these sad, kind eyes, and he said, 'Caleb, son, it'll go easier if you just cooperate.'" Caleb's voice had gone rough. "Son." He called me son. Like he was disappointed in me. Like he was on my side. And everybody in that room watched him say it, and they all decided right then that a man that gentle, and that senior, and that trusted couldn't possibly be the one, and the young black architect with no connections and no golf buddies on the board, and a story that sounded like an excuse. Well, that was a lot easier to believe, too. Adriana felt something cold moving through her. Why didn't it go to trial if they had the logs, if they were so sure? Caleb laughed, and there was no humor in it. Because a trial has discovery, Ms. Whitmore. A trial means somebody like you gets to hire somebody, like the person you've got looking into it now, and that somebody starts pulling threads, and threads have a way of leading back to whoever's actually holding them. Blackwell didn't want a trial. He wanted me gone. He wanted the story to exist just long enough to burn me down, and then he wanted it to disappear before anybody looked too hard. So they didn't press charges. They let me go to avoid the appearance of impropriety. And they let the accusation do the work a conviction would have done, and by the time I might have been able to fight it, I couldn't afford to because no one would hire me, and the money was gone, and I had a wife, and an infant daughter, and rent, and... He stopped. His hands were shaking again. You want to know the cruelest part? The cruelest part is that if they'd actually charged me, I might have been able to clear it. A courtroom might have saved me. But you can't defend yourself against a rumor. There's no trial for a rumor. There's just the door closing over and over at 41 different companies, and nobody ever tells you it's because of the thing. They just tell you they went another direction. The room was silent. 41, Adriana said quietly. 41. Caleb nodded. 2 interviews. Both ended the second somebody made a phone call. And after 8 months of that, I stopped applying to be an engineer because I couldn't afford to keep losing. And I took a job where nobody runs the kind of background check that finds an 11-year-old rumor. Night shift. Because the night shift doesn't ask what you used to be. He looked at her, and his eyes were wet now, and he didn't wipe them, and he didn't look away. My wife left. I don't blame her. She watched it break me, and she couldn't watch it break the baby too. And she took a job in another state, and we agreed Maya would stay with me because whatever else was true, we both knew I'd walk through fire for that little girl. And I have. Every day for 6 years, I have walked through fire, and I have kept her fed, and I have kept her safe, and I have made her believe her daddy is the smartest man in the world. And Ms. Whitmore... His voice broke completely now. The only thing I have ever been afraid of is that someday she'll be old enough to type my name into a computer the way you did today, and she'll read that headline, and she'll believe it, because everybody else did. Adriana Whitmore sat across from him with her own eyes stinging and understood all at once the full weight of the thing crossing this man's face on the security feed. It hadn't been grief for the code. It had been grief for the whole life. The code represented the life that had been taken from him, that he'd walked back into for 12 minutes at 2 in the morning, and then walked away from again because he'd decided it wasn't worth the risk to his daughter. That's why you signed it, a friend, she said. That's why you didn't take credit. It wasn't modesty. No, ma'am. You didn't take credit because you were afraid that if anybody looked into who did it, they'd find the headline. And you'd rather save your company anonymously and keep cleaning it than have anyone connect the fix to the fraud. Yes, ma'am. You saved us, Adriana said slowly. And you were prepared to keep emptying our trash cans afterward. Forever. Rather than risk your daughter finding out you'd touched a computer. I'd have done it 1,000 times, Caleb said. The fixing was easy. It was the getting caught I was afraid of. And I got caught. He wiped his face now once roughly and stood up because he'd said all of it more than he'd said to anyone in 11 years, and he felt scraped hollow. So there's your story, Ms. Whitmore. The whole thing. That's what happened. Now you know as much as I do, and I'd appreciate it if whatever your investigator finds you'd keep my daughter out of it. That's all I ask. She's 7. She still thinks her daddy hung the moon. Let her keep that a while longer. He turned to go. Caleb. He stopped his hand on the door. Renata Cho, Adriana said. The investigator I hired. She called me this afternoon before I came down here. She'd only had a few hours, but she found one thing already. She found where the money went. Adriana stood up. It didn't go to you. It never went to you. It went through 3 shell accounts, and it landed eventually in an offshore structure, and it took her 4 hours to find what a whole firm apparently couldn't find in 11 years. Or didn't want to. And Caleb. The man whose name is on that offshore structure, The man that money has been quietly earning interest for since before your daughter was born. Caleb turned around. Is Richard Blackwell? Adriana said. You were right. You were right the whole time. And in about a week, I'm going to be able to prove it. Not a rumor, not a headline, proof. The kind that holds up, the kind that doesn't disappear. Caleb Johnson stood in the doorway of the supervisor's office, and for the first time in 11 years, the walls he'd built came down, not from fear, but from something else entirely, something he'd almost forgotten the shape of, and his knees went, and he caught himself on the doorframe, and Adriana crossed the room fast and got a hand under his arm. I've got you, she said. Sit down, Caleb, sit down. I've got you. And Caleb Johnson, the janitor, the architect, the father who skipped meals so his daughter could eat the man everybody in that building had spent 3 years looking straight through, sat back down in the broken chair and put his face in his hands and wept, not for himself, not entirely, but for the 7-year-old across town who was never ever going to have to believe that headline now. She'll know, he said into his hands. She'll know I didn't do it. She'll know, Adriana said. The whole world's going to know. He cried for maybe a minute, no longer than that, because 11 years of holding it together doesn't unravel all at once, and part of him was already ashamed to be coming apart in front of the woman who signed the building's paychecks. He pulled himself back with a long, shaky breath and wiped his face with the heel of his hand and sat up straight in the broken chair. I'm sorry, he said. I don't do that. You don't have to apologize to me, Adriana said. Not for that. Not for anything. 11 years, Caleb said mostly to himself. 11 years, and it took somebody 4 hours. He looked up at her. Why did she find it so fast if it was there the whole time, if the money left a trail? Why did it take one afternoon when a whole firm had 11 years? Because a whole firm wasn't looking, Adriana said. She sat back down across from him. That's the answer, Caleb. That's the whole answer. Nobody was looking. Once they had you, they stopped looking. You were the answer that let everybody go home. Richard Blackwell handed them a story that was easy to believe and easy to close, and the second they closed it, nobody had any reason to pull the thread, because pulling the thread would have meant admitting they'd ruined a man's life on a lie, and nobody wants to find that out about themselves. So the trail sat there, for 11 years, in plain sight, waiting for one person to actually go look. Caleb absorbed that, and then, quietly, he said the thing that had been sitting underneath everything all night. You didn't have to look either. You had your fix. Orion was running. The board was happy. You could have paid me off and doubled my salary and kept me sweeping floors and never once had to know any of this. It would have been easier for you not to look. So why did you... Adriana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Can I tell you something I've never told anybody who works for me? Caleb nodded. My father built this company, she said, out of a garage. And when he died, he left it to me, and he left me one sentence. He said, They'll wait for you to fail, Adriana. Don't give them the satisfaction. And I have run this company for 9 years, terrified of that sentence. Terrified of failing. Terrified of everybody who was waiting for me to fail because I was his daughter and not somebody who earned it. She looked at him. And this morning, I sat in my office and I watched a man I'd never bothered to look at save the whole thing. And then I read a headline that said he was a thief, and I had a choice. I could accept the headline the way everybody accepts the easy story, and I could go on being the kind of person who moves the cleaning staff out of her sight without remembering it. Or I could look. And I realized, Caleb, that I have spent 9 years so afraid of being seen as someone who didn't earn her place that I never once stopped to think about all the people who actually earned theirs and got it taken away anyhow. People like you, who did everything right and got waited out and written off by exactly the kind of powerful, comfortable people my father warned me about, except he warned me they'd do it to me, and it never occurred to me that I might be doing it to somebody else. She stopped. Her voice had gotten thick. So I looked, she said, because I couldn't stand to be one more person who didn't. Caleb sat with that. And something passed between them across the scratched table in that small room with the broken coffee maker. Something that wasn't the thing that usually passed between a CEO and a janitor, wasn't power flowing downhill, was just two people who'd both been sized up wrong by the world, recognizing it in each other. "What happens now?" Caleb said. "Now?" Adriana wiped her eyes and got practical, and he could see her doing it. Could see her pulling the CEO back on like a jacket, and he was grateful for it, because he didn't have the strength to hold the raw thing open any longer either. Now Renata finishes the work. She's got the money trail, but a money trail on its own can be argued with. She wants the mechanism, how the credentials got borrowed, the administrative logs from the original system, the actual technical proof that somebody wore your access like a coat, to use your words. And here's the problem. Caleb and I need to be honest with you about it. That system is 11 years old. Halverson got acquired 6 years ago. The data's archived, buried in a format nobody's touched in a decade, sitting on backup infrastructure that the acquiring company mothballed. Renata can get access to it. I can make that happen. I've got the leverage, but getting access to it and reading it are two different things. She needs somebody who understands the architecture, somebody who can go into an 11-year-old system and find the fingerprints. She looked at him steadily. And there's exactly one person alive who understands that architecture well enough to do it in the time we have. Because he built it. "Saul," Caleb went still. "You want me to find the proof myself. I want to give you the chance to," Adriana said. "I'm not going to make you. This is your life, and if you'd rather let Renata's people fumble through it for 6 months, that's your call. But you asked me why she found the money in 4 hours, and the answer is, she knew where to look. And the only person who knows where to look inside that old system, who can walk into 11-year-old logs and know a forged credential from a real one, is you. You could clear your own name, Caleb, with your own hands, the same hands that fixed Orion." She paused. "I think you'd sleep better the rest of your life knowing you were the one who did it." Caleb looked down at his hands again. He'd been looking at them all night. The hands that scrubbed and lifted and cut sandwiches on the diagonal. The hands that had remembered a language everyone assumed he'd never spoken. "When you say I could clear my name," he said slowly, "what does that mean? Practically, for her, for Maya. It means," Adriana said, "that when Renata takes this to the authorities, and she will, this is real fraud. Caleb, this is a federal matter. The record gets corrected. Not quietly, not with an asterisk. The accusation against you gets formally withdrawn on the record, and the man who actually did it gets charged. And that headline, the 11-year-old one your daughter might type your name into someday, it gets buried under 100 new ones that say the opposite. That say you were exonerated. That say you were the one who caught him." She leaned forward. "It means when Maya types your name, the first thing she reads isn't the lie, it's the truth." Caleb was quiet for a long time. "I need to think about it," he said finally. "Of course. Not because I don't want it." He looked up. "Because I've learned not to reach for good things too fast. Every time I've let myself believe something was going to get better, it got taken away. So I don't reach anymore. I think about it first. I make sure it's real." "That's fair," Adriana said softly. "That might be the most reasonable thing anyone's said to me all week." Caleb stood up. And this time when he stood, it wasn't the wary half-crouch of a man ready to bolt. It was just a tired man getting up from a chair. "I've still got the executive floor to turn around," he said. "Before 6. "Caleb." Adriana almost laughed, and there was something helpless in it. "You just saved the company. You don't have to clean the executive floor tonight." "Yeah," Caleb said. "I do. Because until I decide about the rest of it, I've got a job, and the job's the thing that's kept my daughter fed for 3 years, and I'm not going to start half doing it just because you watched me on a camera." He almost smiled. "That's not who I am. Wasn't who I was before either. Whatever Richard Blackwell told everybody. And Adriana Whitmore watched him pick up nothing. He'd left his cart upstairs and walk out of the supervisor's office to go clean the top floor of the building he'd just saved. And she sat alone in the broken chair for a long moment, and then she picked up her phone and called Renata Cho, even though it was nearly 1 in the morning. "He told me the whole thing," Adriana said when Renata picked up. "It's Blackwell. He named him before I did. And Renata, I think he might be willing to help us find the technical proof. He built the original system. He knows where the bodies are buried." There was a pause on the line. Then Renata said, "Adriana, if he can read those archives, this stops being a maybe and becomes a certainty. But I have to tell you something you're not going to like." "What?" "Richard Blackwell isn't a nobody anymore. I've been tracking where he landed. After Halverson got acquired, he took his money, your Mr. Johnson's money technically, and he reinvented himself. He sits on boards now, advisory positions. He's respectable. He's got relationships with people who matter, and Adriana—" Renata paused. "One of the boards he advises. It's a firm that does business with your firm. He's not in your building, but he's in your world. And the second we start pulling this thread, he's going to feel it. And men like Richard Blackwell did not stay comfortable for 11 years by not noticing when someone tugs the thread. He's going to know, and he's going to move." Adriana was quiet. "How fast do we have to be?" she said. "Faster than him," Renata said. "Which means I need those archives, and I need someone who can read them, and I need it in days, not weeks. If he gets wind of this and starts shredding or gets to the archived data before we do, he can't get to the data. I control the access to it now. I made sure of that this afternoon." "He can't get to the data," Renata agreed. "But he can get to people. He can get lawyers. He can get ahead of the story the way he got ahead of it 11 years ago. He's done it once. He knows exactly how. The reason it worked the first time is he moved fast and Caleb moved slow, because Caleb didn't know he was in a fight until he'd already lost it. This time, we don't give him that. This time, Caleb moves first." Adriana looked at the door Caleb had just walked out of. "I'll talk to him," she said. "Tomorrow. I'll give him the night to think, and I'll talk to him tomorrow." Up on the executive floor, Caleb was emptying wastebaskets and wiping down the long glass table in the boardroom, where 12 hours earlier, Adriana had told 14 powerful people that Orion was saved without ever mentioning his name. He didn't know that. He just cleaned the room methodically, the way he cleaned every room, and he thought. He thought about Maya. He thought about the offer. He thought about clearing his name and what it would mean. And every time he let himself imagine it. Really, imagine it. Imagine his daughter reading the truth instead of the lie. His chest did something painful because he'd trained himself so thoroughly not to want things, that wanting this one felt dangerous, felt like standing too close to an edge. And he thought about Richard Blackwell. He hadn't let himself think about Richard Blackwell in years. It was too expensive. Every time the man's face surfaced, the silver hair, the warm voice, the folded hands, "Son, it'll go easier if you just cooperate." Caleb felt a rage so total it frightened him. And rage was a luxury. A single father on the night shift couldn't afford. So he'd learned to put the man in a box and nail it shut. Now the box was open, and the rage was there, right where he'd left it, undiminished by 11 years, and he stood in the boardroom with a rag in his hand, and let himself feel it for a moment. And then he did something that surprised him. He set the rage down. Not because he forgave the man. He didn't. He wasn't sure he ever would. But standing in that boardroom at 1 in the morning, Caleb understood something with sudden clarity, that if he did this, if he clawed his way back into that old system and pulled out the proof, he had to decide right now before he started what he was doing it for. Because there were 2 different men who could go into those archives. There was the man who wanted to burn Richard Blackwell to the ground, who wanted to watch him lose everything the way Caleb had lost everything, who wanted revenge so badly he could taste it. And there was the man who just wanted his daughter to read the truth. Those 2 men would go into the same archives, but they'd come out different. The first man would come out poisoned. The second man might come out free. "I want her to read the truth," Caleb said out loud to the empty boardroom. "That's it. That's the whole thing. Not him. Her." And having said it, he felt the rage settle back down into its box, not nailed shut. This time just closed quietly by his own hand and on his own terms. He finished the executive floor at 4:50. He clocked out at 5:10. And on the bus home for the second morning in a row, he didn't sleep. But this time, it wasn't dread that kept him awake. It was the strange, terrifying, unfamiliar sensation of hope. And he sat with it the whole way home, holding it carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure you're allowed to keep. Maya was at the kitchen table when he came in. Spelling homework. Tongue out. "Daddy's home." "Yeah, baby, Daddy's home." She looked up at him, and something in his face must have been different because she tilted her head the way she did when she was working out a problem. "You look weird again, but a good weird this time." Caleb laughed. He couldn't help it. "Yeah, what's good weird look like?" "Like when I get 100 on a test, but I'm scared to tell you in case I heard the grade wrong." And Caleb stopped because that was exactly it. That was precisely the thing he was feeling, and his 7-year-old had named it in one sentence. "That's yeah," he said. "That's about right. I might have some good news, Maya, but I'm being careful with it, making sure it's real before I get too happy." "Is it about work?" "Sort of." "Did they finally figure out how smart you are?" Caleb set down his keys and came over and sat down across from her, and he looked at his daughter. 2 missing teeth pencil in her fist. Absolute unshakable faith in him, written across her whole face. And he thought about how she had never once, not for a single day of her life, doubted that her father was exactly who he said he was. She was the only person in 11 years who'd never needed proof. "Maya," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer." "Okay." "If somebody said something bad about me a long time ago, something that wasn't true, and I had a chance to prove it wasn't true, but proving it might mean my life gets busy and complicated for a while, and there might be some hard days, would you want me to do it? Or would you rather things just stay the way they are, nice and quiet, just you and me?" Maya thought about it. She really did. He could see her taking it seriously, turning it over the way he'd taught her to turn over hard questions. "Did they say something mean about you?" she said. "Somebody did, a long time ago." "Was it true?" "No, baby, it wasn't true." Maya's face set into something fierce, something that looked so much like her mother that it made his chest ache. "Then you have to prove it," she said. "You have to, because it's not fair for people to think something bad about you that isn't true. That's the worst thing." She frowned. "I don't care if it gets busy. You're always busy, and you still make my sandwiches right. You can be busy and still be my daddy. But you can't let people be wrong about you. That's not right." Caleb looked at his daughter for a long moment. And then he reached across the table and took her small hand in his big one. The hand that had fixed Orion, the hand that had built the very architecture he was now going to walk back into, and he held it. "Okay," he said. "Okay, baby, then I'll do it." "Good," Maya said, satisfied, and pulled her hand back to keep writing. "Now can you help me? I keep spelling February wrong. Why is there an R that doesn't even make a sound?" And Caleb laughed, a real one from somewhere deep, and he pulled his chair around next to hers and helped his daughter spell the hard word. And outside the window, the morning came up over the city. And somewhere across that city, a man named Richard Blackwell was sleeping soundly in a bed, bought with stolen money, not yet knowing that the one man who could ruin him had just decided at his own kitchen table, with his daughter's blessing, to stop being invisible for good. Later that day, after he'd slept a few hours, Caleb called the number Adriana had written on the back of a card and pressed into his hand before he left the supervisor's office. She picked up on the first ring like she'd been waiting. "It's Caleb Johnson," he said. "Caleb, hi. Did you—" "I'll do it," Caleb said. "I'll go into the archives. I'll find your proof." He paused. "But I want to be clear with you about why, because it matters to me that you understand it. I'm not doing it to destroy Richard Blackwell. If that happens, and it should, God knows it should, that's the law's business, not mine. I'm doing it for one reason. I've got a little girl who's going to type my name into a computer someday, and when she does, I want the truth to be the first thing she finds. That's it. That's the whole reason. If you're looking for somebody who wants revenge, you've got the wrong man. But if you want somebody who wants the truth on the record so his daughter can read it—" His voice steadied. "Then I'm your man. When do we start?" There was a silence on the line, and when Adriana spoke again, her voice was not quite steady either. "Tomorrow," she said. "We start tomorrow. And Caleb, for what it's worth, the fact that that's your reason. That's exactly why I know you didn't do it. A guilty man wants to win. An innocent man just wants the truth told." A pause. "I'll see you tomorrow. Come in during the day this time. Through the front doors." Caleb held the phone for a moment after she'd hung up. Through the front doors. In 3 years, he had only ever come and gone through the loading dock in the back in the dark, before the building filled up and after it emptied out. He had never once walked through the front doors of Whitmore Technologies in the daylight. Tomorrow, he would. He walked through the front doors at 9 o'clock the next morning, and it was the strangest feeling of his life. Not because anyone stopped him. Nobody stopped him. That was the strange part. For 3 years, he'd used the loading dock in the back, because he'd believed somewhere deep that the front doors weren't for him, that a man in a gray uniform who came out at night was not the kind of man those tall glass doors were built to admit. And now, he walked through them in a clean shirt at 9 in the morning, and the security guard nodded at him, and a woman in a suit held the inner door, and the whole thing swung open, like it had been waiting for him the entire time. And Caleb understood, standing in the bright lobby he'd only ever cleaned in the dark, that the door had never been the thing keeping him out. He'd been keeping himself out, because the world had taught him where he belonged, and he'd believed it, and belief is the only lock that actually holds. Adriana was waiting for him by the elevators. Not an assistant. Her. "You came through the front," she said. "You told me to." "I did." She almost smiled. "How'd it feel?" Caleb thought about it. "Like I was allowed to," he said finally. "Which is a stranger feeling than you'd think." They rode up together, not the service elevator, the real one, the fast glass one that looked out over the city, and Adriana took him not to her office, but to a conference room where a woman was already waiting, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, a laptop open in front of her, and 3 others closed and stacked beside it. She stood when they came in. "Mr. Johnson," she said, and put out her hand. "Renata Cho. I'm the one who's been looking into your life for the last 2 days. I imagine that's an unsettling thing to hear, so let me say the important part first. Everything I've found says the same thing. You didn't do it, and I'm going to prove it, and I think you're going to help me." Caleb shook her hand. "You found the money in 4 hours." "I found where it went in 4 hours," Renata corrected. "Which is enough to make me certain, and nowhere near enough to make it stick. Money trails can be argued. Blackwell's lawyers will say the offshore structure isn't his, that his name got attached through some clerical accident. That correlation isn't causation. What I need, what turns certain into proven, is the mechanism. I need to show how your credentials ended up on those transactions when you didn't make them. And that lives in the original Halverson system logs, which are 11 years old, archived in a dead format, sitting on backup infrastructure that hasn't been powered up since the acquisition." She looked at him. "Adriana got me access this morning. It's spinning up now. But I've got 2 forensic analysts who've been staring at it for an hour, and they can't even read the directory structure. It's proprietary. It's old. And the man who designed it is me," Caleb said. "Is you." Renata gestured at the empty chair beside her. "So, Mr. Johnson, would you like to go find your own innocence, because I think it's in there? I just can't read the language it's written in. But you can." Caleb sat down, and for the second time in 3 days, he put his hands on a keyboard and remembered who he was. It came back the way it had come back in the engineering bay. Not learned, not recalled. Just there, the architecture rising up in his mind like a house he'd built and could still walk through blindfolded. He knew where the access logs lived because he'd decided where they'd live. He knew how the credential system stamped each transaction because he'd designed the stamp. And he knew this was the thing the two forensic analysts couldn't have known, the thing no one but the builder could know, that he'd put a second, quieter log underneath the main one. A shadow log. A redundancy he'd built in years ago out of pure engineering paranoia. A habit of never trusting a single source of truth that recorded not just which credential authorized a transaction, but which physical terminal the authorization came from. "There's a second log," Caleb said quietly 40 minutes in, and both women leaned toward the screen. "I built a shadow record. Nobody knew about it but me. It wasn't in the documentation. It was a thing I did, a habit. In case the main log ever got tampered with, I'd have something to check it against." His hands moved. "The main log says my credentials authorized every one of those transfers. Blackwell knew about the main log. Anybody with admin access knew about the main log. That's the one he forged. But the shadow log..." A directory opened. A file unspooled across the screen, rows and rows of it. "The shadow log records the terminal, and Ms. Cho, my credentials on every single one of those fraudulent transfers came from the same physical machine, Terminal 114. Renata was very still. Whose terminal was 114? Caleb pulled up a second file. An old asset registry. He scrolled. He stopped. And he sat back in the chair and let out a breath 11 years in the making. Terminal 114, he said, was the administrative workstation in Richard Blackwell's office. "My credentials made those transfers from a machine I never sat at in a room I wasn't allowed into, that belonged to the one man with the access to wear my name like a coat. It's right here. It's been right here the whole time." Under the log everybody looked at, there was a second log nobody knew to look at, and it's been sitting on a dead server for 11 years pointing directly at him. The room was silent. Renata Cho reached over slowly and turned one of her closed laptops around and opened it and started recording her screen. "Mr. Johnson," she said, and her voice had changed, gone crisp and careful the way a prosecutor's voice goes when the case walks in the door. "I'm going to need you to walk me through exactly what you just did on the record, step by step, so that I can hand this to a forensic team who will replicate it independently and testify that they reached the same place without your help. Because a defense attorney is going to say you planted it. And I'm going to be able to show them that two analysts who'd never met you found the same terminal ID by following your documentation. Can you do that?" "I can do that," Caleb said. "Then let's do it right," Renata said. "Because we are only going to get to do this once, and when we do it, it has to be a wall that Richard Blackwell cannot climb, cannot buy, and cannot make disappear the way he made you disappear." They worked for 6 hours. Caleb walked her through every step documented. Every path showed the analysts where the shadow log lived and how to read it, and how to verify it hadn't been altered. And by the end of it, there were 4 people in that room who could stand in front of anyone and show in plain forensic fact that the transfers that destroyed Caleb Johnson's life had originated from Richard Blackwell's own terminal. And somewhere in the middle of it, around the 4th hour, Renata's phone buzzed, and she looked at it, and her face tightened. "He knows," she said. Adriana looked up. "What?" "Blackwell. A contact of mine at one of the firms he advises." Words moving. Somebody told somebody that there's an inquiry into the old Halverson matter. He's felt the thread. She set the phone down. "He's going to move. Lawyers probably first. Get ahead of the story. He's done it before." Caleb felt the old cold fear reach up for him. The fear that this was the moment it all slipped away again, the way it had slipped away last time, when he'd moved slow and Blackwell had moved fast. He looked at the screen. The shadow log. Terminal 114. "He can't get ahead of this," Caleb said, and he was surprised by how steady his own voice was. Last time he got ahead of it because there was nothing solid, just an accusation and a rumor, and rumors you can steer. This isn't a rumor. This is a terminal ID on a server he doesn't control and can't reach, verified by people he's never met. He can hire every lawyer in the state. It doesn't move Terminal 114. He looked at Renata. "Am I wrong?" Renata Cho looked at him, and slowly, for the first time all day, she smiled. "No, Mr. Johnson," she said. "You are not wrong. He can move as fast as he wants. He's 11 years too late." She took it to the authorities the following week. Caleb didn't go to the meetings where it happened. He didn't want to. Renata offered to bring him, and he thought about it, and he realized he had no desire to sit in a room and watch the machinery grind the other way. No hunger to see Richard Blackwell's face when the questions started. He'd made his decision at his own kitchen table with his daughter's hand in his, and the decision held. He wasn't in this for the man's downfall. He was in it for the truth on the record. But the downfall came anyway, because that's what happens when the truth finally gets on the record. The federal investigation opened fast because Renata had built it to open fast-handed over on a platter with the mechanism proven and the money traced, and 2 independent analysts ready to testify. The offshore structure got frozen. The accounts got subpoenaed. And Richard Blackwell, silver-haired, respectable, comfortable for 11 years on money that had never been his, discovered that the story he'd steered so easily the first time did not steer at all the second time, because there was nothing to steer. There was just Terminal 114 sitting on a server telling the truth in a language only the man he'd framed could read. The formal exoneration came 6 weeks later. It wasn't loud the way the accusation had been loud. Truth rarely is. But it was on the record, permanent, official, unqualified. The original matter was reviewed, and the finding reversed. A statement was issued. And within days, the search engines that had held that 11-year-old headline like a stone around Caleb's neck began one by one to bury it. New articles rose over the old one. The man who was accused, the man who was cleared, the man who caught the real thief inside his own architecture, the janitor who turned out to be the engineer. The story ran, and it ran the way the good stories run, and somewhere in the machinery of the world, the version of Caleb Johnson that Richard Blackwell had built began finally to die, and the true one began to live. Adriana called him the day the exoneration posted. "Type your name in," she said. Caleb was standing in his kitchen. Maya was at school. He walked to the little laptop on the counter, an old one held together with the same patience he held everything together with. And he opened it, and he typed his own name into the search bar, the way he'd been terrified for 11 years of his daughter one day doing. And the first thing that came up was the truth. He stood there in his kitchen and looked at it for a long time. "Caleb," Adriana said. "You there?" "I'm here," he said. His voice wasn't quite working. "What's it say?" "It says—" He stopped. He read it again to be sure. "It says I was cleared. It's the first thing, the very first thing." He put his hand flat on the counter to steady himself. 11 years and it's the first thing now. "That's what she'll find," Adriana said gently. "When Maya types your name, that's what she'll find first." And Caleb Johnson, who had skipped his own meals so his daughter could eat, who had cut 10,000 sandwiches on the diagonal, because a straight cut was a crime, who had made a little girl believe. Her father hung the moon, while the whole rest of the world told a lie about him. Caleb Johnson put his hand over his mouth in his empty kitchen and cried. And this time there was nothing underneath the crying but relief clean all the way down. There was one more conversation a few weeks after that. Adriana called him into her office, the real one. The top floor, the one he'd only ever cleaned. She'd offered him a job already, weeks before the day they finished the archives, Chief Systems Architect. The title he'd have earned a decade ago if the world had let him real money, real respect his name on the door of a department. And Caleb had asked for one thing before he said yes, one condition, and he asked for it again now to be sure she'd meant it. "I need to be home in the afternoons," he said, "when she gets off the bus. That's not negotiable. I'll work early. I'll work late after she's asleep. I'll work harder than anybody you've got. But 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock belongs to Maya. It has for 6 years through everything. When I had nothing else to give her, I had that, and I'm not giving it up now that things are good. If the job costs me the afternoons, I don't want the job." "Caleb," Adriana said, "you saved this company before you were even on the payroll. You think I'm going to argue with you about afternoons?" She slid a piece of paper across the desk. "It's already in the contract. Article 4. Read it." He read it. Article 4. In writing. His afternoons protected in the terms of employment of the chief systems architect of Whitmore Technologies. You put it in writing, he said. You taught me something, Adriana said, about what happens when things aren't on the record. I'm not making that mistake with you twice. Caleb signed it, right there, and then he looked up at her. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why me? Not the fix. I know why the fix, but this. He gestured at the office, the title, the contract, the whole improbable turn his life had taken. You could have paid me a settlement and cleared my name and shaken my hand and let me go be an architect somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't remind me of the worst night of my life 50 floors down. Why keep me here? Adriana was quiet for a moment. Adriana. Because of the note, she said. The one you left. You have good people in this room. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She looked at him. You wrote that to a room full of exhausted engineers you thought would never know it was you. You had nothing to gain. You were disappearing back into the dark and you knew it. And on your way out, the last thing you did was make sure the young people you'd just saved knew they were good, that they weren't the failures somebody upstairs was about to call them. Her voice caught. That's the person I want building the systems this company runs on, Caleb. Not just the smartest one in the building, though you are. The one who on the worst night of his life on his way back to invisibility stopped to tell some kid he'd never met that he mattered. You can't hire that. You can't train it. You either are that or you're not. And you are. She shook her head. Deshaun Price found out it was you, by the way, a while ago. He put it together. You know what he did? What? Nothing. He didn't say a word to you. He transferred onto your team the day you started, requested it specifically, said he wanted to learn from whoever the friend was. Adriana smiled. He's out there right now, waiting to work for you. He never told you because he didn't think he had the right, so I'm telling you. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about the kid with his head in his hands at 3 a.m. We're going to lose it. He thought about how close he'd come to walking past that legal pad and letting the boy take the fall. How close he'd come to staying invisible. He was the reason, Caleb said. That night. He was the reason I sat down. I couldn't watch it happen to him. I know, Adriana said. That's why he wants to work for you. He knows it too. He built a life after that, a real one in daylight. He was good at the job, better than good the way he'd always been. Except now there was no lie following him down the hall, no averted eyes, no rumor waiting at the bottom of a phone call. He led a team and Deshaun Price was on it, and Caleb taught the young engineers the thing he'd learned the hardest possible way, that the flaw is almost never where everyone's looking. That the loudest, most obvious explanation is usually the lazy one. And that when something breaks and everyone starts hunting for a name to blame the right thing to do, the only thing is to slow down and find out what actually happened before you decide who pays for it. They called it half-joking. The first rule of the Johnson team: find the fault before you find the fault. Find the flaw before you find the person to blame. He never told them where he'd learned it. He didn't have to. Enough of them knew the story by then. And every afternoon at 3 o'clock, no matter what was on fire, no matter which billion-dollar system was groaning under load, Caleb Johnson stood up from his desk on the top floor of the building he'd once cleaned at night, and he rode the elevator down, and he walked out the front doors into the daylight, and he went home to meet his daughter's bus. Maya was 9 now. She'd figured out most of it. Kids do eventually. The walls get thin, and one afternoon walking home from the bus stop, she'd asked him about it. About the bad thing people used to say. About whether it was fixed now. It's fixed, Caleb told her, because you proved it wasn't true. Because I proved it wasn't true. Maya walked a few steps, thinking her backpack bouncing. Then she said, Daddy, were you ever scared? When people thought the bad thing. Were you scared it would never get fixed? And Caleb Johnson thought about 11 years. He thought about 41 closed doors and 2 interviews that ended with a phone call. He thought about the loading dock in the dark, and the box he'd built to keep himself small and safe. He thought about the night he'd stood in front of a wall of monitors and almost walked away. Yeah, baby, he said. "I was scared for a long time, longer than you've been alive." "But you fixed it anyway." "I did it anyway," Caleb said. "Because it was the right thing, and because you told me I had to." He squeezed her hand. "You remember that you sat at the kitchen table and you told me I couldn't let people be wrong about me, that it wasn't right." Maya grinned, missing fewer teeth now. "I was smart." "You were the smartest one in the building," Caleb said. "You always were." They walked the rest of the way home, holding hands, the way they'd walked to the bus stop 10,000 times, back when he was invisible, and she was the only person on Earth who could see him. And Caleb thought about the thing Adriana had said months earlier, standing in front of the whole company at a meeting she'd made him attend, even though he'd tried to get out of it, how she'd looked out at hundreds of employees and told them the biggest mistake she'd ever made was thinking she knew a man because of what he wore. How she'd looked right at him, sitting in the third row with Maya beside him, swinging her feet, and said that the smartest person in the building doesn't always have the biggest office, that sometimes it's the person quietly working in the background, waiting for somebody to finally see them. He'd been embarrassed sitting there. He didn't like being looked at. 11 years of hiding doesn't wash off in a season. But Maya had leaned over that day and whispered, "She's talking about you, Daddy." And he'd said, "I know, baby." And she'd whispered fierce and proud, "Everybody can see you now." And that was the truth of it in the end. Not that a janitor turned out to be a genius. Not that a CEO learned a lesson though she did. Not even that a guilty man was finally punished though he was. The truth was simpler and harder than any of that. The truth was that a man had been made invisible by people who decided what he was worth before they ever knew who he was, and that his worth had never once depended on their seeing it. He had been exactly who he was the entire time. In the dark, pushing a cart. In the daylight, running a department. On the worst night of his life and the best one. The uniform never changed the man underneath it. The only thing that ever changed was whether the world was willing to look. Caleb Johnson stopped being invisible the night he decided to, and no one ever again would get to decide who he was before they knew his name.